And with that, I'm going to just turn it over to him, and he can maybe give you a little bit of history of what he's doing, because he has a new job assignment really at the moment. So anyways, but I'll let him introduce himself a little bit more, and then with that we'll go. So I do have this recording, and so I think we're good. Thank you.
All right, well, I'll get started today, and hopefully you guys can see my slides. So as Dawn mentioned, I'm the State Extension Beef Cattle Specialist. I'm also the State BQA Coordinator, and as of a few months ago, I'm now the Director of our research station located at Lingle. So I'm still in my office at Lingle near Torrington tonight. I thought I'd have probably a little better internet connection from here than at my home. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about monitoring health in your livestock project, and just kind of touch on some animal husbandry things. So I think this works really well for me because I do quite a bit of BQA stuff, and this ties in very closely with beef quality assurance. And I think this is, so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some things. I'll caution you now, since I am the beef specialist, I tend to be a little bit heavy on beef and cattle pictures, and probably some goat pictures. My daughter shows goats. My two sons show cattle. So hopefully this will make sense, and we can kind of go through this as we go. So again, we're going to talk a little bit about monitoring your livestock project, what to look for, some things to think about as you grow and develop your project, and just some general husbandry practices and some things to think about as you do your project. All right. So one of the first things to think about is this idea of animal well-being. So the health of your animal is important not only for your own project or not only important for the animal, but it's an industry issue. So if you think about your project, often we get pretty wrapped up and pretty concerned about making sure our animal makes weight, making sure our animal stays healthy, and maybe that's the minimum. Maybe we want to make sure we get our animal to fair. But when we think about our project, especially if we're showing a livestock project or a meat animal, a market project, and honestly, there's more to it. I think there's certainly we need to think about not only are we producing a market animal, but we're producing food for someone. The idea with a market animal is that we're getting that animal to a certain weight, but that animal is finish ready when we take that animal to fair. The idea being it's going to be food for a consumer at some point down the chain. So whatever we do to that animal, how we manage that animal is important, not only to the animal itself and not only important to the success of your project, but it's important for the consumer that purchases that animal. It's important for whoever, whether it ends up on a restaurant plate, whether it ends up where it ends up. It's important to think that we're producing food. We're not just producing a product or doing a project. We're producing food for someone that's out there. So animal well-being is important. And the other thing to think about is it's an industry issue because it's how people perceive what we're doing. So if we raise animals and we obviously, because we're around them on a daily basis, we want to raise animals that are healthy, raise animals that are happy, because if they're healthy and happy, they're gaining weight and they're doing well and they're remaining productive. But we need to educate our consumers, and also I think we need to have that appearance that we're doing a good job as managers of our livestock and what we're doing. So animal well-being not only affects the animal, not only affects us, but it affects the industry, it affects the consumers that we're working with, and we need to be aware of that from an industry standpoint, whether we're talking about any market animal, whether it's pigs or sheep or goats or cattle, all of an important thing to think about. So when you think about animal health, you could kind of group it. This is my grouping, or I think this is maybe one way to think about animal health. And I guess I'm approaching this from the idea is when you feed your animal daily or twice a day or sometimes 3 times a day or more, depending on your project, what you're trying to accomplish, we need to be thinking about and doing some observation, being good managers of our project, being good managers of the animals that we're responsible for. And so I kind of grouped it a little bit from an animal health standpoint. We tend to think there are some health issues that are nutrition-based, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But certainly they can be related to how we feed that animal and how we address some of those things and how we manage the feed being delivered to that animal. So there are nutrition-based illnesses, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But there's also infection or disease-related illnesses as well. And those can be respiratory illnesses. They can be like pneumonia. There can be other bacterially spread diseases such as pink eye or foot rot. These are bacteria. So we need to manage those. That's an infection, essentially, that we need to manage. And hopefully we can think of some management practices that help us do a better job of managing that animal and managing the health of that animal. So that's husbandry in my interpretation. Husbandry is our ability to handle and take care of the well-being of those animals that we're responsible for. And so we talk about nutrition and infection. The third one would probably be lameness of that animal. And that can be derived by several different things. So those three things are things we think about every time we feed that animal or every time we go out into the pen to work with that animal. Is that animal healthy? And we address these things as how is he digestively? And we'll talk about some things to think about. How is he from a health or from a respiratory or a breathing or that type of thing? From an infection standpoint, how is he? And is he sound? Is he still sound, or is there anything we need to address from that standpoint? So animal health can hit on all three of those things, and hopefully we'll kind of walk through those as we go. So I kind of think I've kind of categorized or color-coded what I want to talk about tonight in these 7 categories. Kind of a lucky number. Hopefully we can kind of think about these things or kind of break them down into these categories. And hopefully I've got some pictures. Hopefully we can kind of relate to some of these things that we're trying to talk about. But in a lot of way, our animal health, our management of that animal can be impacted by these 7 things, whether it's nutrition. We'll talk about that. It can be impacted by our vaccination program and making sure we're current and active with our vaccination program. It's our biosecurity practices. How do we handle that animal when we take them to shows or when we share fitting equipment or when we mix that animal with maybe some of the animals we already have at home? Biosecurity is a part of the animal health part of it. Feeding, not only nutrition, but feeding management is important. We need to think a little bit about our facilities and where we keep the animal and things to address there. And then I think just general, if we're doing good husbandry practices, we're being very observant when we work with our animal and when we look at that animal. So observation skills and observation technique when we look and when we feed and when we work with that animal are important. And finally, confirmation. Certainly from a soundness standpoint, something we need to think about. Maybe that's something we think about as early as when we select that animal or when we decide what animal we want to show or choose or purchase for our project. Confirmation is a part of that as well. So those 7 things can all influence the health of our animal, and we'll kind of talk about those as we go through. So I've kind of color-coded these. Hopefully this kind of makes sense as we go through them. So the first one I had in the bottom left-hand corner was herd nutrition. So certainly I'm a nutritionist by training, and the last couple of years I've talked mainly on nutrition-based topics, so I'm not going to go into great detail about nutrition. But we know certainly for that animal to be healthy, we need to feed a balanced diet. And we've talked about this in the past, and certainly providing adequate energy for whatever growth rate we want in that animal. So providing energy, a good source of protein, and making sure vitamins and minerals are balanced in that diet as well. All important things to think about, and certainly they have an impact on health of the animal. We provide a balanced diet just like you and I. We perform better. We do better in sports. We do better in school. We don't fight with our brothers and sisters as much. We don't have those Snickers moments, right, if we're adequately fed. So nutrition is important. Understanding the requirements and how that changes, especially if you're feeding breeding animals or you're growing or lambing or kidding out your own animals. We know that those requirements of that animal changes depending on the age of the animal and its stage of production. The other thing we'll talk about more in feeding management is the idea that not only do we need to feed the correct amount, we need to be precise when we do it. So we need to measure accurately and be consistent every time. So if we feed the same amount every day, we need to be consistent about that. We can't, the more consistent we are, the better it is for the animal. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And certainly feeding on a regular schedule is important as well. and clean water. So you can't talk about nutrition without talking about water, probably the most important nutrient that we have. So making sure they have the ice is broke, they've got clean water, available water to them, and it's accessible for them. So the tank's not too tall, it's easily accessible by the animal, the ice is broke, it's clean water, the tank has been cleaned. All of those things are important. Herd nutrition is a big part of herd health. It's a big part of husbandry and management of that animal. The other thing I talked a little bit about, and I've got a lot of slides on this, I'm not going to go into great detail, but certainly we know that vaccinating that animal to try and prevent disease is important from a husbandry practice or from a management standpoint as well. So certainly we know that that animal's response to a vaccine is related to overall nutrition. So hopefully we'll get the best response to a vaccine if that animal is healthy and receiving a good balanced diet. That's important. The thing we need to remember, though, especially if we're managing several animals or we're commingling animals, is that when we vaccinate those animals, not every animal responds to that vaccine. So we may give all of them, and the conditions may be ideal, and hopefully all animals are healthy. We give the shot in the correct location, we're giving the correct dose, we do all of those things right, we're still not guaranteed that every animal will respond 100% to a vaccination. So that's why we talk about giving a booster shot when we can, because giving 2 shots not only enhances the first shot and enhances that animal's response, but it provides some more protection or some more safety that over the course of 2 vaccinations, hopefully we've got all of those animals responding to a vaccine and providing some level of protection. So that's important when we think about it. And then finally, think about vaccines as an insurance policy. They can be expensive, but they're not nearly as expensive as getting an animal sick and perhaps getting an animal extremely sick, that animal losing weight, and then we've got to regain all of that weight loss and try and get that animal back on course to be ready for fair. So in a lot of ways, it's a vaccination program. It may seem expensive at the time, but it's good insurance to make sure that animal doesn't get sick later. And there's a lot of vaccines out there, and this is probably geared more towards beef cattle and certainly sheep and goats to some extent. A lot of times we'll give a 7-way vaccine, and that's to eliminate a lot of the bacteria that are known to cause problems in growing animals. If we give shots, a lot of times to sheep and goats, we'll give a C, D, and T shot. These are all clostridial diseases that are very common in these animals. And so we typically, that's a bare minimum. We give a 7-way shot or a C, D, and T shot to our sheep, our goat, our cattle, those types of things. So vaccines are important. We know from a cattle standpoint that we need to vaccinate for respiratory diseases as well, those that cause pneumonia in the animal, that can cause that animal to be short of breath or to have a discharge from his nose, those types of things. So there are a lot of vaccines out there to consider and think about giving to your animal. Just some things to think about. If we're going to give a vaccine and we're going to take the time to buy the vaccine, we need to make sure we give that shot correctly. So giving the correct dose in the neck area or in front of the shoulder is important, following BQA guidelines. Making sure the syringe and the needle that we use are clean, making sure we keep the vaccines out of direct sunlight, and making sure that we use the correct technique to administer that. We've spent the money on the vaccine. We need to make sure we give it correctly to that animal. This is just kind of my list of things to think about or go through, whether we're giving an antibiotic shot or giving a vaccine. Make sure we use good technique, make sure we give it in the correct location, make sure we're using the proper dose. All of those things are important for the health of your animal. There are specialty vaccines out there too, and many of you are familiar with them. We can give vaccinations for warts. We can give vaccinations for pink eye. We can give vaccinations for foot rot. All of these types of things that maybe cause us problems. In many cases, there are vaccines. That doesn't mean we're going to completely eliminate that issue, but we may reduce the severity and make it more manageable for us. So a lot of these things are available. It's good to talk to your parent or talk to a veterinarian or maybe someone that you work in your club leader or somebody that's comfortable or familiar with these types of things, and make sure you've got a good vaccination program going. All right, other thing to think about from a health standpoint, again, all of these things are building, trying to, I guess, in my mind, if that animal does become sick, now we've got a bigger issue to deal with. I'm trying to approach this from the idea that how can we, from a management standpoint and from a husbandry standpoint, think of some ways to prevent disease. How can we manage that animal to remain healthy and prevent the chance that he's going to get sick? So we've talked about nutrition and vaccines. Biosecurity is a big one, and biosecurity is a big word, but it can mean a lot of different things. It's basically how can we manage to reduce the transmission of bacteria or any of these types of pathogens. So a lot of times if we buy a new animal, we want to isolate that animal for a period of time, at least 2 to 3 weeks, to make sure he's healthy before we introduce him to the rest of our animals. So that's important when we think about mixing or purchasing an animal from, maybe it's from, you purchased a 4-H animal that's from outside of your herd, and now you want to bring him home. If you can, possibly isolate that animal to make sure he's healthy before you introduce him to your healthy animals at home. Vaccinate him soon, as sooner the better. And certainly if you're start showing or jackpotting or taking some animals to different shows, make sure you pay attention to detail and try and reduce that biosecurity, or think about your biosecurity technique and reduce the transmission of any disease through cleaning your show equipment, cleaning your stall if at all possible, disinfecting your stall. All of these things are important. We know how, especially with sheep and goat and pigs, to some extent, if we're taking these to different shows, we're taking them to new environments, there's a chance that we'll pick something up with that. So if we can eliminate that by cleaning our stalls, cleaning our equipment, maintaining things very cleanly, we can reduce the chance of that happening. And then be cautious when you share equipment. Now, in many cases, we do share a lot of equipment, but taking those additional steps to maybe clean the equipment, make sure there's no issues there is pretty important. Another thing we maybe don't always think about is try and minimize the stresses on our animals. So we take our animals to a show, we think, well, they're tame, they should be comfortable wherever we're going, but in many cases it's a strange environment for those animals. They may not appear stressed, but in many cases maybe they are, whether it's strange noises, loud noises, too many animals in one place. We may cause some additional stress to that animal. That causes that animal essentially to weaken its immune response and make it more susceptible. So if we show that animal a lot, or we take him into a lot of unique environments or new places, we're exposing ourselves to more chance of sickness. That's not all bad. There's nothing wrong with taking an animal to show and making sure you're competitive with that animal, but make sure you take those preventative steps to try and reduce disease. So biosecurity is a part of that as well. And so certainly we keep the animal clean. We can disinfect the pen or the stall when at all possible, and try and isolate your animal as best you can, whether it's putting up dividers, putting in partitions, those types of things. All of these things help from a biosecurity standpoint. How can we reduce the transmission of a pathogen or a disease from animals that may be sick or may be sick at that show? All of those things are important. Okay, back to feeding again. We talked about nutrition already and the ration that we feed. Well, let's think a little bit more about our feeding management and how we manage that animal. So you probably have heard your parents get after you about when you feed, make sure you feed exact amounts. I know some families use a scale and make sure and weigh the exact amounts every single time. Or you have some type of measuring tool, whether it's a pitcher or a can or some type of measuring cup or something like that, to make sure you feed precise amounts. Now, it's important from the animal standpoint. Any variation or any fluctuation you get in the amount that you feed can cause that animal, can increase the chance of some type of maybe a digestive problem with that animal, or even can impact the performance of that animal. So we want to feed consistently and precisely. If you are feeding a grain or feeding a market animal, you have to work them up slowly and don't fluctuate that. So you have to work them up on a grain or a concentrate or a high energy diet slowly to make sure their rumen adapts. They become used to that as well. And so any abrupt changes in the diet are detrimental to that animal. So we try and do a good job of gradually working them up on a grain diet and then consistently feeding the correct amount to that animal. Other thing to think about is to feed on a regular basis. And I know for many of you, I know for my own kids, that becomes really tough when we've got practices and games and a lot of different things on our schedule. The more consistent we can be on when we feed that animal, the better it is for that animal. So working a deal with your brother or sister to make sure we're feeding at the same time every day is pretty important. And maybe working with your parent or working with someone that's located near the animals just to make sure those animals are consistently fed is pretty important. The other thing to think about when you are feeding is to check that bunk. So that helps you determine whether or not that animal's healthy, but it also helps you make sure to see if the bunk is clean. Is there any moldy feed there? Is there any feed that needs to be, or spoiled feed that needs to be removed? We need to get that out of the bunk and discard that, keep a clean surface for that animal to eat. That helps you. So if you've got a clean bunk, that helps you measure and monitor how much that animal's eating. So you've got a better feel for it if you start every time when you start or when you introduce that feed. If the bunk's clean, you know exactly how much is being fed or how much is available to that animal every time. So feeding management on a consistent basis is important as well. So the other thing to think about is facilities. And sometimes there's not a lot we can do about this, but you know, however we manage that can have an impact on the animal as well. So if we've got that animal in an outside pen, we'd like it to be as clean and as dry as possible. We'll talk a little bit about adequate space for that animal, adequate protection. So if we can block the wind, that's great. If we can maybe get that animal or give that animal the ability to go inside, that's also important as well. And just in general, providing a healthy environment for that animal. It improves their gain, it improves their overall health, it reduces the chance of that animal getting sick. So all of those things are important. We'll talk a little bit about design of facilities. You don't have to have a fancy facility, but if you have a clean facility that's got all of these sharp objects, it's got a lot of the little things addressed, you're well on your way to having a successful project. All right. So if you think about if you're working that animal, there are requirements, and this is kind of some beef quality assurance or livestock quality assurance information, that when you do work with animals, make sure the facilities or the panels or the fences that you use are appropriate for the animal. So it's sized correctly, hopefully, so you eliminate the chance of an animal getting injured. And if you're working with steers or bigger animals, you want to reduce the risk of you getting injured as well. So having everything working correctly. If you've got fences and alleyways, you want to make sure there are no nails sticking out. Everything is pounded in, is smooth. There's nothing going to snag an animal or cause an animal to become lame. So just a general upkeep and general maintenance of where you keep the animal is important. Just some observations. And certainly when we work animals, we want to make sure the facilities reduce the stress on that animal as well. So hopefully what we've got, the animal's comfortable with them, is familiar with them. It helps from a health and a management standpoint as well. So here's supposed to be a funny slide. This is a slide from North Dakota, actually, of their attempt at a wing to gather cattle. So this is a gathering wing or a fence, or not really a fence. Well, it's an attempt at a fence to try and get the animals into an area. So whether it's, all of these things can be used. You can be resourceful. You can look at a lot of these different things, but just making sure you're thinking of the animal, keeping the animal safety in mind are pretty important. Not everybody has really fancy, elaborate facilities that are spotless and concrete floors and clean metal and all of those types of things. That's certainly not everybody has that, but you can keep things clean. You can keep things as dry as possible. You can reduce any risk of injury by making sure the nails are pounded in. There's nothing loose or free or stray on the ground. There's no chance of lameness or them stepping on something. You can address those little things like that just to make sure that animal is ready to go. This is a slide, just put some different pictures in there of working facilities and handling facilities. The idea being not everybody has the same situation, but if you can use whatever you have, you can make you can make things work. You can make them safe just by paying attention to detail. This is a slide from Argentina. They actually, when you look at working facilities in Argentina, they use very little metal. About everything's made out of wood. The nice thing is it's extremely heavy, but it's also very quiet. It doesn't clank around, and it's a great way to work cattle. And in this case, real hardwood that they use, and they actually built their squeeze chutes out of wood, which it's a modern squeeze chute. It's just made out of wood. So pretty interesting things out there. There's a lot of different things. And as I mentioned, you can be resourceful. You don't have to have concrete feed bunks. You can find, just like in this slide, you can cut a barrel in half, you can cut a barrel in half and use it as a feed bunk. You can make a feed bunk like they did out of a tarp. Just as long as you keep it clean, you make sure you manage things correctly, it's safe for the animal, you can accomplish all of those things. So you can improvise and do whatever you need to. You can make anything work. Clean bunks and adequate space. If you've got a lot of animals, making sure you provide adequate space for all animals to have equal access to feed is pretty important. You may have a group of sheep or a group of goats, and a lot of times they create a pecking order. And so you need to provide adequate space so that even the dominant ones and the timid ones have equal access to get to feed. So bunk space is a part of this and is important to think about. There are requirements out there, so if you're curious, you can find there are resources online. There's a lot of different publications that can tell you how much space is deemed adequate for your project. So this is out of the Midwest Plan Service. This is a list of lot space, or how much pen space is needed for growing calves, for finishing steers, and it tells you square footage. And so there is information out there. It tells you kind of rough ideas of what you need for a minimum amount of shelter space, how much bunk space they need when they go eat, all of these things. So this information is available, but a lot of times you can figure that out on your own. When you feed those animals, when you're observant, you can see if every animal's getting equal access to be able to eat, making sure they've got a dry place to lay, and they're protected from the wind. All right, here's another example. This is from my home, actually. One summer, we actually, extremely hot summer, we weren't able to keep that animal. So we actually had, this is an electric fence. We moved this animal to a dry area. We put up an electric fence, and we built a shelter out of a tarp and a couple of panels. And so anything works, and certainly the shade was very important, especially in an extremely hot summer, providing some shade, getting that animal out on some dry ground, and was really important for the health of this animal. So you can adapt and make things work. Certainly the condition of the pen is important too. Not ever do you always have the ability to move them to a different pen or to a different location, but certainly we know how important it is to have dry space for that animal, not only from its health standpoint, but from hoof health, from a lameness standpoint, from its exposure to disease. All of these things are critical. So hopefully you've got a pen with some drainage, that the water we can move out of there. They've got a dry place to lay down, and they've got adequate space. Not only adequate space to move around, but adequate space at the bunk as well. Protection during birthing, whether it's kidding out goats or lambing or calving, all of these things are pretty important. So it can be anywhere. It can be a horse stall, as in this picture, as long as you provide good, clean bedding, you provide an adequate space for that animal, and they're protected from the elements. All of these things are certainly important when we think about raising and managing and monitoring that animal. So those are all important. Something to think about, we've talked a lot about providing wind protection, and we know how important that is. We're over here in Wheatland, and as you probably all know, southeastern Wyoming is always windy. And so we're concerned about the wind speed and how it impacts them. So this is a wind chill chart that shows it's a combination of temperature and wind speed and how it affects the animal. So we call it wind chill. We also call it real feel. So the combination of temperature and wind speed can have an additive effect of feeling extremely cold. So the example here is if it's completely calm, the temperature 40 degrees, that's your temperature. But if you start to have wind as you start to move down this scale and get windier days, a 40-degree day with a 30-mile-per-hour wind, it actually feels like 28 degrees. So for example, in many days in the winter, we can have a day that's maybe 5 or 10 degrees. So kind of cold, but it's above zero. Now, if we throw a 35 mile per hour or 30 mile per hour wind on top of a 5-degree day, now we're looking at a wind chill of a minus 19. So there's a real big additive effect of not only the temperature, but the wind speed. So providing some type of wind protection so you can get that animal out of direct wind can have a real impact on the health of that animal. So whether it's a windbreak, whether it's some trees, the side of a building, or you construct some type of windbreak, all of these things are important for animal health. And we know how important it is. As that animal gets wet, it really does chill that animal down. That animal relies on its hair coat and its hide to provide some type of insulated layer. And when that hide gets wet, when that hair gets wet, now all of a sudden it's exposed to more cold temperatures. So hopefully we can address that too. That's why certainly with our smaller species, whether it's sheep and goats, if we can provide them some protection inside and keep them out of those elements, it really helps us out. All right, healthy environment. So that's important as well. Certainly from a performance standpoint, if that animal has the ability to exercise, enjoys the area where it's at, it's beneficial. It's going to remain healthy. It's going to remain hungry. If it's active, it's going to be more, have a better appetite, and overall health is important. So healthy environment for that animal, if at all possible, is important. So here an example, we've got a dry pen with some equipment on it to, I guess, give them something to do during the day. It's going to cause more activity. It's going to cause the increase appetite in those animals. Okay, so the big thing I want to talk about is thinking about observation and how we manage that animal on a daily basis. So the idea is to be very observant every time you feed. So when you go into the pen, make sure the pen is clean as possible. Make sure the gates are secure. Make sure there's no loose materials on the ground, like a board with a nail sticking out of it, anything like that. Making sure we pick those things up whenever we see them, or fix the fence when we need to, make sure the gate's secure, all of those things. So these are little things to think about every time you feed. A lot of times we get in a hurry. We're trying to hurry and get to school, or we're trying to hurry and catch the bus, or we're really battling night and it's dark and we get home from practice and we don't want to take the time to do it. So sometimes we rush things. And I guess my message here is that, oh, if you just take a few more seconds, look at the pen, check their water, make sure the water is adequate, make sure it's clean, make sure the ice is broken. Look at their bunks, observe how much feed is left in that bunk before you feed them. All of these things are important. Looking at that animal, and we'll talk a little bit about that more. Watch him breathe for a minute. Watch him take a few breaths. Is he really rapidly breathing or shallow breaths like he's in pain? Is he breathing normally? Does he have any discharge from his eyes? All of these things. So look at the animal a little bit. These little, just 5 to 10 to 15 seconds to do these observations are pretty important from a husbandry standpoint. So we've checked their eyes, right? So certainly I've got a picture of it, but this can happen to any animal. They get poked in the eye with a piece of hay, or they get bump a corner, or they bump a piece of wire or anything like that. Just checking them, and it doesn't take any time at all. You probably look at them anyway. Just pay attention to those details. You look at their eyes, make sure their eyes are clear, their eyes are not cloudy, make sure there's no discharge from their eyes. You look at their nose, making sure that they don't have any discharge or any issues with their nose. That helps you identify sickness and maybe helps you identify it earlier. The earlier we treat an animal, the better chance we have of success and the less or smaller impact it has on their performance and their weight gain and their ability to respond to that illness, right? So the quicker we catch it, the more important it is. So just taking your time to look at that animal are pretty important. We look for bloat, right? So we look at that animal, whether it's a lamb or a goat or a steer or a heifer, and we look to see if that animal has any distension Maybe he looks a little fuller than he should. Recognizing that early and addressing it early is real important and can avoid any problems later on. So again, you check the bunk for the remaining feed. You watch the animal. Does he get up when you walk into the pen? Does he come over to the bunk like he's hungry? How much feed is left in the bunk? And if you have any questions, who should I ask, or should I ask for help or advice? You talk to your parent, or maybe you work with your club leader, or maybe you have a good relationship with your veterinarian or your extension educator. All of these people, you can look at those resources and don't hesitate to ask. I always say, I tell my kids, you're going to get into more trouble if you don't ask than by asking. So take the time. I know your parents look busy sometimes and you're afraid to interrupt them, but be sure if you've got a question or you think there's an issue, make sure you talk to somebody and ask and try and address that. All right, time to talk just a little bit about lameness, and I'm just about done here. But certainly that's another thing to think about as even when we select animals. There's a lot of factors that go into whether an animal stays sound all the way through fair. It can be genetic, it can be structural, and it can be how the pen looks, making sure you pick up any foreign objects, make sure the pen is dry and clean. All of these things impact lameness. But we think about structural correctness when we buy an animal. You may seem funny to talk about lameness when we're talking about health, but in a lot of ways it is another health impact. So certainly lameness, it can be injury, it can be an infection, it can be pain to that animal. All of these things impact the quality of the animal, the performance of the animal. So addressing these types of things are pretty important. Thinking about conformation when you purchase an animal or you selected that of your own herd. Making sure you select those things that maybe will eliminate the chance of that animal becoming lame later on. Look at the straightness in the legs. Looking at the conformation issues are pretty important. The other thing to think about, maybe you don't have the ability to, but we know that certainly the disposition of that animal, how wild that animal is, or the ability of that animal to nurse when it's young, if we're raising those types of animals, are all pretty key to the health of the animal. So we know that immune transfer is pretty important. This is a picture of a calf. This is a Simmental calf that was way too big. So this calf was born and it needed a lot of assistance when it was born. That calf looks yellow. So a white-faced Simmental animal has a yellow face because that's meconium. That's poop. That's that animal so stressed when it was born that it has poop all over it, so it's his own meconium. It's the first poop that comes out of that animal. That animal is so stressed, and it's evident there because he's completely covered in it. So not only was it stressful when he was born, that has a lifetime impact on that animal. So we think about birth weight when we do sire selection. We think about birth weight maybe when we select an animal for our market. All of those things can be impacted. That animal's stress on that animal can have a long-term impact on him throughout its feeding program or throughout its lifetime. Other things, making sure that animal gets adequate colostrum is important as well, because we know that first milk out of that animal has that's where it gets a lot of its antibodies when it's a young animal. That's where it gets a lot of its energy and its protein and its ability to fight off disease is from that early nursing with that cow. So the docility, the temperament of that cow is important to think about as well. So things to think about not only are structural correctness and maybe udder correctness, but temperament. When we talk about temperament and docility, we're talking about the same thing. How wild or how tame is that animal? So we want that, and that's going to impact not only the health of that animal, it's going to impact our ability to show that animal too, right? So selecting that tame animal, working with that animal until it's tame is pretty important. So temperament is the behavior of that animal or how that animal reacts to stimulus or reacts to you working with it. That's temperament. Docility is also the calmness, how that animal calmly reacts to things around it. So an animal that's docile is an animal that's tame. An animal that's high-strung can have a reduced performance, has an increased chance of sickness, has an increased chance of becoming lame, and has an increased chance of not only hurting him itself, but hurting other people as well. So culling decisions and selection decisions, even including temperament or docility, is important as well. Okay, we're about done. I know I'm about out of time here, but I'm just going to kind of summarize a few things and talk about why these things are important. So we talked about these things from an animal health standpoint, whether it's nutrition, infection, or lameness issues, how we address that with the animal. We talked about developing a strategy and these 7 things that can impact the health of the animal that you're trying to grow and raise and use as a show animal, whether it's nutrition, vaccination, biosecurity, feeding management, facilities, observation, conformation of that animal. All of these things impact overall health. National Cattlemen's Association has taken it a step further. They essentially, when you go through BQA or even livestock quality assurance, they're asking you to kind of follow these principles when you raise an animal. So I'm just going to read them to you, and I think they're important things to think about. And the whole idea here is not only are you raising an animal or raising a livestock project or a market project, you're raising something that's going to eventually perhaps be food and going to be sold to a consumer. So we believe in the humane treatment of farm animals and in the continued stewardship of all of our resources. So we're being good stewards, having good husbandry practices. I believe in the cattle will be healthier and more productive when good husbandry practices are used. I believe that my and the future generations will benefit from my ability to sustain and conserve natural resources. So not only are we being good stewards of our animals, we're being good stewards of our environment. We want to support research efforts focusing on production systems that are efficient and promote animal well-being. It's my responsibility to produce a safe and wholesome product. I think that's key for anyone working with livestock, is that we want that animal to be safe. We want that animal, whatever we're producing from a food standpoint, to be a wholesome product. And this is kind of an interesting one. We believe that animals have the right to use agricultural animals. So this comes and plays with consumers. And a lot of times we need people to understand that the livestock that we work with have a role, they have a purpose, and we're working and we're acting as caretakers of those animals. We're responsible for the wellness, the health of that animal. That's our responsibility as producers, as owners of that animal, as a person, as the person responsible for the husbandry of that animal. All right, so the last thing I want to touch base here is 4 things at the bottom of this slide. Number 1, take your time if you can. Be observant. Observe the pen, observe the gates, observe the water, observe the feed bunk, observe the animal itself. If you have any concerns, ask for help. And as a parent and as somebody that works with livestock all of the time, if we recognize a problem or identify a problem early on, it's a lot easier to treat and it's a lot easier to fix the earlier we recognize it. So don't be afraid to ask questions and ask for help. Reduce the chance of sickness through your management. So how you manage that animal, how you manage the pen, how you manage the nutrition, all have an impact on the health and performance of that animal. And as I mentioned, it's always important to catch situations early and make sure that you address those things early on. And with that, I think that's the last I have. And I would offer, if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask them. And I think I'm finished.
Perfect. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? You guys are a pretty quiet group tonight. That was really good, Dr. Paisley. Very good. So any questions from any of you 3?
No, they're all muted. So